Good afternoon. Glad everybody could make it for our latest installment of the Climate Science Center Interdisciplinary Seminar Series. Today's series will deal with energy, and we want to thank the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work for your sponsorship today. It really helps us put these things on. Before we get to the panelists, first I want to mention our next site spot, the GLASS seminar. Now I know Schrodinger's cat from my limited academic, abilities, but I don't know about Schrodinger's chicken. I think he may have ran into Colonel Sanders. I don't know. This will be ecological facts about a threatened prairie grouse with Dr. Blake Grisham. It's going to be on April the 12th at the Fox and Hound over on 82nd and Quaker. The happy hour starts at 5 and the talk starts at 10, so we encourage everybody to come out. Or, sorry, at 6 usually. Well, we'll give you 5 hours to get loose for this. 5 and 6. We want to get out there because everybody else will start showing up at 10, and that's when the pool starts going and all that kind of stuff. So encourage everybody to come out. As we mentioned, today's seminar series is on energy. We've got 3 expert panelists for you today. The first one I want to introduce is Robert Forbus. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. His research interests are primarily concerned with environmental politics and policy, with an emphasis on the policy nexus of environmental protection and energy development. His research specifically addresses political conflicts triggered by the hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as we all know it, energy resource development process. He teaches courses in public lands and resource management, sustainability, energy, and environmental policy. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Forbus.
Okay, this is going to be kind of a quasi sort of take on a paper that I just finished presenting in San Diego at the Western Political Science Conference. And one of the reasons I want to emphasize this is because this is about a shift to renewables and alternatives and the political conflicts that have been triggered by that shift. Most primarily, that political conflict has been triggered by solar. And I'm co-authoring this with Michael Giberson. And I want you to notice that I'm coming from the Department of Political Science and the Climate Science Center. Dr. Giberson is coming from the Free Market Institute. And there's a reason why this is particularly true, because the conflict in many ways with solar panels or solar installation is kind of a grassroots thing. You've got utility monopolies who are going to the utility commission meetings in the states, and they're trying to reverse what's known as a net metering fee. The traditional net metering fee was, in a sense, if you produced energy, you were paid, or your bill was reduced because you were producing energy to the line, to the grid. But more and more persons are installing solar, small businesses are installing solar, and so the utility monopolies, the big companies, now have gone to these commissions and sought to reverse the net metering fee, and now they want to charge you for hooking up to the line for maintenance purposes and so on and so forth. And as we get into, Texas has come up with a rather unique way of dealing with this. But first, kind of need to understand the history and future of competition, because basically these big companies are very risk averse. And we've known for quite some time from the 1940s that over time this particular use of fossil fuels to generate electricity would eventually go away once we have the technological capacity, and once we figured out that a return on investment, or ROI, would shrink over time. And that's become very true lately. And basically what we're saying is that ultimately these industries have to embrace this technology because it will make things better all the way around, not just simply for society, but for the climate as well. So what's this looking like? Well, this comes from U.S. News & World Report last year. And basically, the argument is being made, and it has been for a while, that we're in the middle of an economic transformation that's based on energy. As they say, this new transformation will be seen most clearly in 2 sectors, transportation and utilities. By 2030, which is not far off, the transformation will be nearly complete. And basically, they're making the argument that the age of fossil fuels is coming to an end. Now, I'm going to stress one caveat to that sort of declaration is that we will always need oil and gas. There is no possible way to completely rid ourselves of fossil fuels, but we can reduce our consumption of them to the greatest degree possible. And that's where the new technologies come in. So what we're seeing is a drop in prices, big time. Coal, in terms of its economics, has gone down almost 30% by 2016. Natural gas has dropped by 50%, and oil 70%, which means it's getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. But there's an interesting dynamic going on in that we're not consuming as much. The old way of thinking was kind of the energy paradox, is that the cheaper the energy got, the more we used. And so supply and demand, and this is why we go through boom and bust cycles with fossil fuels. But here's the annual investment in renewables. It's climbing, it's going off the charts. And basically what they're arguing, this is Bloomberg Economics, is basically saying that by 2035, we should reach $350 billion in capital investment in renewables. That is a big time shift. So what's the economic arguments? Well, coal and gas-fired electricity is becoming more expensive and profits less predictable. The opposite is true of wind and solar. Wind power, including U.S. subsidies, became the cheapest electricity in the United States for the first time last year. And solar power is a bit further behind in that model, but the costs are dropping rapidly, especially those associated with financing a new project. The old return on investment cycle was anywhere between 15 to 20 years. And now, if you're a private investor, so you own a home and you want to put solar panels up, with all the sort of market and government subsidies and machinations and the new technology, your return on investment is now shrunk to 3 to 5 years, which isn't very long. So how are we growing? Well, you'll hear from Steve here pretty soon from LP&L. It's basically solar installations have broadened more than tenfold in the past 5 years. Utility scale solar in 2007, basically there were 0 utility scale. Now there are hundreds across the United States. And in California, dozens and dozens of 10 and 20 and 50 megawatt projects across the United States. Big solar plants provide measly, it's 0.6% of all our overall electricity, but in 2015, it accounted for 57% of all new installed solar capacity. According to the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, 9.5 gigawatts of utility solar is scheduled for installation in this year alone. That's more than any other single energy source, including natural gas. So what are the strengths? Well, the price. The price of solar is getting cheaper. And in terms of its predictability, you know what solar power costs. Solar cost, so your solar cost is basically the PV installation. After that, how much does it cost to draw energy from the sun? Nothing. It's 0. There is no fuel cost. So in strength, more states are beginning to have plants. The weakness at this point is the capacity of the power plant in terms of capable of producing generated electricity around the clock. So that capacity factor, although the technology is rapidly catching up with it. And as they argue, big solar is about to get unstoppable. It basically has outgrown the first machinations of policy and will outgrow the latter in the next 5 years. So the argument made here in Lubbock, and I did this in December at the Science by the Glass, the argument made here in Lubbock is that it's too dusty, that solar panels will lose their efficiency because the wind blows here all the time and it's dusty constantly, and solar panels covered in dust basically will lose their capacity to generate electricity. So this is a picture from an airplane of a haboob rolling in, as we're all familiar with across the plain. And this is that same haboob coming into Lubbock. And that's what it looks like. I mean, we've seen it. Those of us who've lived here long enough, we've seen it. But here's the interesting thing. Who can tell me what this is? Those of you who went to the December Science for the Glass, you're not allowed to answer. Anybody? This would be a picture of Mars. This is a dust storm in Mars. Dust storms in Mars are global. They're in their reach. They're not just centrally located. And one of the reasons that I found this so fascinating is because after I'd heard that solar capacity was marginalized by the dust storms and the dust here in Lubbock, I was laying in bed watching a National Geographic special on the Mars program. And what they said was, you're right, the dust comes up, it covers the panels, and we lose capacity to generate electricity and move the rover around. But then the wind picks up again, and it blows all the dust off. And they basically were saying that we have to be very careful about how much we run the Mars rover for fear of burning the batteries out because it's producing so much energy. So the question becomes, if the argument is that it's too dusty and windy here, well, you telling me that Lubbock's environment is worse than Mars? It really doesn't fit logically. So what's the potential? This is from the Energy Information Agency. The yellow dots are existing solar, and this is a dated version because my TA took a picture. What's the town? Bakersfield. Bakersfield. There's a whole new solar plant going up in Bakersfield. So this needs to be updated a little bit, but you can see by the color, the basic colors here is that the darker the area, the greater capacity there is for solar, and yet there's only really 4 solar plants out there. So the capacity for growing large solar, absent just the localized grassroots movement, is still enormous. In Texas wind, they go to wind for renewables. There's a lot of wind around here, and I know Steve's going to touch on it here later on, but there's still enormous room for growth, for capacity building. In terms of that capital investment, these are 2012 numbers, $452 billion and from government to support fossil fuel production, as compared to $121 billion for renewable energy. And this is 2012 private investment, $674 billion and $281 in renewables. So it still favored fossil fuels. And so the coal industry argues that we're going to lose jobs and so on and so forth. There's a lobbying effort to prevent these sorts of transitions. And the groups that are attacking solar across the United States are numerous. But if you dig deeper into these, so the American Legislative Council, ALEC, is the leading sort of force behind all this. This is a group that is funded primarily from fossil fuel industries, the Koch brothers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They recently had some success in Nevada, the state which has the highest potential for solar. They basically went with the model that customers were going to pay the net metering fee rather than receive the benefits. And on the day the law took effect, every one of the private solar industry persons out of Silicon Valley that were operating in Nevada left the state. So in a sense, solar has come to an abrupt halt in Nevada.
Robert?
Yes.
If you collapse those farms, because I saw olive in several of the states.
Right.
I have some floaters in my eyes, so my vision isn't that good. But if you collapse the number of groups, how many groups are we really looking at in total?
About 8 to 10. All of them, in some form or fashion, are being funded and created by the fossil fuel industry. These are where these groups are working in terms of state legislatures and utility commissions to battle grassroots efforts to not reverse the net metering fees. And so this kind of gets you down to what you were talking about, crunching. This is one focus on Kansas. But if you notice, there's 36, there's basically 8. So in any given state, there's 8 to 10 of these that are working. Alan's argument basically says that those using home solar will increase fees for users who are free riders to the utility companies. This is an unfair advantage, they argue. They also argue that because they're not receiving profits, they're going to have to charge more for traditional utility, and those persons who can afford to do the solar are going to bear the burden of their ability to make money. Which is interesting from Dr. Giberson's perspective, and mine as well, is that these utility companies, in a sense, and I use this term absolutely intentionally, are dinosaurs. And the reason being is because they are risk averse. They're not shifting their ability to alter their business plan to address the current market. Bloomberg News, kind of repetitive, but basically 2030, $60-30 billion. By 2030, 73% of total capital investment will be in renewables. The yellow, as you can see, is all solar. The blue is in wind. The green is in biomass. Purple is geothermal and hydro. And you get down here to the bottom, nuclear, oil, gas, coal. These are all shrinking tremendously. So why is this important for climate? Well, we can go along the business as usual path. This is from Dr. Hayo. At +3 degrees per year, basically, you see the worst case scenario. And down here in the green is the 2.6 model. The only way we get to 2.6, according to Catherine and others, is if we shift our economic sort of balance away from fossil fuels and towards these renewables. And that way, we hit the 2.6. We no longer go along what Catherine refers to as the doomsday path, but rather along what she refers to as the fairy dust path. So, in conclusion, it is a green economy that we're looking for, although there are those who would say that, as this one points out, the green economy bears no electricity. That's simply not true. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Forrest. Our next panelist is Esty Epstein. She is an internal medicine specialist. She has served as an instructor, assistant professor, and associate professor of internal medicine at the Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center from '85 to '95, then moved into her current position in private practice in Lubbock. Dr. Epstein has been a member of the Lubbock City Board of Health since 2010. She has served as chair of the Educational Policy Committee at Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center and as a member of the Texas Tech University Health Sciences Biomedical Ethics Committee and Institutional Review Board. Dr. Epstein.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. Can everybody hear me? Okay. My interest in oil and gas development is from the health risks in my work at the Board of Health for Lubbock. My main focus here is on toxic air emissions, the volatile organic compounds that are emitted along with natural gas and oil development, probably paralleling methane emissions. And for this purpose, I'm focusing on benzene, one of the volatile organic compounds that can form ozone. But this substance is extremely toxic in itself and was a good place to focus. This is a class 1 carcinogen. In other words, its carcinogenic effects are completely indisputable. It causes leukemia. It also causes a variety of non-cancer diseases that suppress the bone marrow, life-threatening anemias, immune system suppression, and possible fetal abnormalities. Very high levels of benzene can produce seizures, coma, and death. And children and developing fetuses are much more vulnerable to the effects of toxic air emissions. Now, the oil and gas infrastructure is plagued by leaks, and some of these leaks include leaks of benzene. This is a study from the Texas Commission of Environmental Quality, which regulates toxic air emissions in the state of Texas. They surveyed in 2009 looking for leaks and for toxic air emissions. They used a variety of infrared cameras and volatile organic compound monitors to survey 94 different sites in 2009. They collected air samples based on what they saw at 73 sites. And what they found was that at 21 different monitoring sites, benzene levels were above levels that were considered safe. And at 2 sites, benzene levels were in the acutely toxic range and required immediate remediation. So what we're finding is, and this is a picture from the infrared FLIR camera of a storage battery set of storage tanks. The black smoke is leaking volatile organic compounds that contain benzene, among other toxins. Now, Mackenzie and her colleagues from the University of Colorado measured benzene levels. Actually, they used data from industry, a combination of industry and Colorado regulatory data. That was volatile organic compound monitors, benzene monitors that were set up between 130 and 300 feet from a series of oil and gas wells in Colorado. And they compared the levels of benzene, ethylbenzene, toluene, and xylenes close to wells compared to a reference point that was 2,600 feet away. And what they found was dramatic rises in these VTECs, that is, these hydrocarbon volatile organic compound molecules, close to wells compared to further away. We don't have much data on benzene levels close to wells versus further away, but this is one of the best studies to date. This was old now, 2012, showing dramatic increases close to wells. This she did as part of a health impact assessment and measuring benzene levels and determining whether or not, or projecting health effects. And what they found was that for people who lived close by natural gas development, they projected a 5-time increase, see if I can get this, health impact assessment, a 5 times, not 5% greater, but a 5 times greater health impact based on living close to oil and gas facilities compared to living far away. This is a health impact assessment projections. This isn't data as a result. This is a projected result. And finally, Gabriela Petron and her colleagues from the National Oceanic and Aerospace Administration and the University of Colorado collaborated to do airborne measurements using this cool plane over here to do a top-down evaluation of benzene and other air emissions, including methane. And you may have heard this study referenced in studies of methane leaks, but she also monitored benzene. And this is an area over the Denver-Julesburg Basin. This is an area of very intense oil and gas development. There are 24,000 active wells in this area. It is an ozone non-attainment area. And previous studies have shown that oil and gas account for 40% of volatile organic compounds in this area. These were 12 aircraft measurements in May of 2012 compared to ground-based wind profilers. And what they found was that benzene emissions were 7 to 9 times higher than that they measured. Measured benzene emissions were 7 to 9 times higher than was estimated by the state of Colorado inventories. So you might know that when people apply for oil and gas permits, they are required to estimate their emissions. And the producers are required to estimate emissions. And those estimations are based on industry records and standards about how much is expected to leak and be emitted during ordinary operations. And so this state of Colorado inventory expects a certain number of benzene emissions, but as you can see, the actual measured amount was considerably greater than the state's estimation. So based on these elevated levels of toxic air emissions, I looked at studies that have currently been done regarding health effects. And there are very few, but let me show you the 4 major ones that are quite significant. This is the biggest study so far. This was done again by Kim Mackenzie and her colleagues, the same people who did the health impact assessment in Colorado. They looked at a cohort of birth records, all the birth records in Colorado compared to all hospital records of birth defects. Remember, I had said that benzene and toxic air emissions have a greater effect on developing fetuses and children. So a good place to look for toxic effects would be in pregnancy and developing babies. They had, their data set included 124,000 birth records. And they compared these to a map of gas wells and plotted how close, for each record, how close the mother lived to a gas well at the time of childbirth. And they divided into 3 groups, low, high, and medium exposure. Notice the high exposure group is over 124 wells per mile. And the reference group was no gas wells within 10 miles. And here is what they found, the number of babies born with congenital heart disease. This is major heart disease requiring surgery and perhaps a lifetime of medical follow-up for these babies. There was a linear increase compared to 0 wells within 10 miles. For people in the low exposure group, 1 to 3 wells per mile, 10% increase of congenital heart disease. For medium exposure group, 20% increased risk. And for the high exposure group, 30% increased risk. These were all, you can see that tremendous p-value, all highly significant and adjusted for multiple risk factors that might have influenced benzene, or might have influenced volatile organic compound exposure. This is the biggest study to date. And since then, this is June 2015, there was a similarly designed study coming again from Pennsylvania. This is an area of very intense natural gas development in the Marcellus Shale. 15,000 birth records, 509 active wells, estimated exposure. What they found was that babies that were in the highest quintile of natural gas exposure, greater than 6 wells per mile, had a 34% greater chance of having low birth weight compared to the lowest quartile. Once again, statistically significant. And another study in Pennsylvania, 10,000 babies compared to, once again, location compared to well location. In the highest quartile, those babies had a 40% increased risk of premature birth compared to babies in the lowest quartile. It wasn't just babies. We have finally data on adults. This came out, this was all coming out last summer. This was a record, a review of hospital records, 95,000 hospital records in Pennsylvania. Again, sorted by zip code for wells. You know, which wells had the most wells, and which zip codes had the most wells, and which zip codes had the highest concentration of wells. And what they found was that adults who lived in zip codes with the highest concentration of wells had a greater number of hospitalizations for heart disease. And in the highest quintile, there was 44.7 hospitalizations for heart disease compared to the expected, which was 35, a very significant increase. There was also an increase in adult hospitalizations for neurologic disease. This is for people who are living close to gas wells. So in summary, the health risks for oil and gas wells have just recently been published, and we're seeing significant increases in health risks and in diseases in babies and adults for people who live very close to gas wells. Remember, oil and gas development has really just been started since 2008, and so there's been rather few studies until finally this group of studies have come out in the last 2 years. So we on the Board of Health had recommended to the Lubbock City Council that we increase setbacks, that we require that wells be built further away from people than they are now. The state of Texas requires that wells be built now only 250 feet away from residences. And as you can see from Mackenzie's data that I showed you, toxic air emissions are very high, very close by. We expect that procedures that will reduce methane emissions will also reduce emissions of these dangerous volatile organic compounds and hopefully reduce some of the disease. But wherever there are gas wells, there are toxins in the air. There seems to be a significant leak problem, and we suspect that the ordinary process of natural gas development also produces a substantial amount of benzene. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Epstein. Our final panelist today is Steve Moon. He is the Electric Promotion Coordinator and Utility Specialist in Energy Efficiency for Lubbock Power and Light. 2009, he received the Energy Efficiency Manager Certification from the American Public Power Association. Having been trained in their program, he has stayed actively involved in the energy efficiency realm. He earned his marketing degree from the University of Texas in 1982 and has worked for 4 decades in the public relations field. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Moon. What's that? Yeah.
Get his head off.
Kill it? Yeah.
Oh, okay. My bad, sorry.
Excellent. Thank you. Hello, everyone. So, I work for the power company. My sheepskins burn orange, and I have no slides. And they say you only get one chance to make a good first impression. I have been with Lubbock Power and Light for approximately 12 years now. And my title, Electric Promotion Coordinator, is a little bit confusing. What I do essentially is I'm public relations for all commercial customers in the city of Lubbock. And I'm also the first care of the energy efficiency efforts that we have at this time. I deal mainly with key accounts, that is customers that write really big checks every month. I am standing in the middle of a very good example of a key account right now, that being Texas Tech University. I deal with other customers as needed, smaller customers when I'm called on. But for the most part, I'm in the field on the front lines and taking care of folks and their needs for electric utilities. If there's a storm in town and Covenant's power goes out at 3 o'clock in the morning, the phone next to my bed rings. So if you wonder who the guy is that gets that call, it's me. What do I do with respect to energy efficiency? Because really, when you want to talk about climate science, the parallel in my world is energy efficiency. I've learned that in Lubbock, often if you say green, you better be talking about money, because you can hear the word tree hugger come out of someone's mouth real quick. But quite frankly, I have found many ways to work within the public realm to assist people in their needs, and by lowering their expenses, helping them save money on their electricity, we also decrease their carbon footprint. I work a lot with our bigger accounts when they have different things that they do here in the city. I was involved in a very interesting Kaizen with the Six Sigma here a few years ago, where we went in and studied the inner workings of a rather large commercial customer and found ways for them to save money. I've been on scavenger hunts where they get the whole crew together. Again, these are typically national companies. Get everybody together and bring in folks like myself, vendors from the outside, maybe bring in folks from corporate office, and basically see what we can do to find ways within a facility here in Lubbock, Texas, to decrease their electric usage. That saves them money. It's green that way. It's green in ways that climate science is interested in as well. I've gone out and done a number of lighting assessments with customers. We really don't have, at this point in time, the kind of rebate programs and retrofit programs that you find in some other markets. That's because we are a municipally owned utility. We're owned by the citizens of Lubbock. We're not required to have such a program. And effectively what we do right now, what we have stressed to this point, is to keep our costs as low as possible and do what we can for the whole, as opposed to just a few, which is what happens when you're dealing with programs like a retrofit program. It's not unusual for me to have someone call from a corporate office, say, for example, in Dallas, and say, well, tell us about your LED retrofit program. I said, well, we don't have one of those right now. I said, well, let's talk about energy credits. I said, well, I've heard about those. You know. And in frustration, they'll say, well, what do you do? I say, well, I noticed that last year your average cost per kilowatt hour was 6.2 cents. I said, that's an awesome program. you stick with that program. We really like it. In time, we're going to be doing more because the price of electricity is only going to go up. Recently, we've seen it go down, and we've seen it go down because of the things that Dr. Forrest was describing earlier. We're also seeing in the state of Texas a lot of things happen that are making real inroads in renewable energy. And that's exciting. It's very exciting. I thought it was interesting that on the flyer, it said we were going to discuss our relevance to climate science. And I like to feel like I'm relevant. So I intentionally made some notes about that. And there are 3 areas where I feel like someone from the municipal utility locally is relevant to the Climate Science Center. First of all is an increase in awareness. I'm talking this out there every day. And we recently had a community fair that we did with Luna. And I have a little light bulb dog and pony show that I like to do. I don't know how many of you have tried to shop for light bulbs lately. I know those of you who are closer to my age who have shopped for light bulbs lately have probably found that it's a little different than it used to be. All you had to used to know was you want a 100-watt bulb for the living room, you need a 60-watt bulb for the bedroom, and the lamp next to the nightstand takes a 40-watt bulb. If that's all you know when you go to the store today, you've got a problem. Secondly, I'm striving for unity. It's important to me to have our community all work together. And so I am part of the government. So you have the public sector, the private sector who I work with every day, and then here I am in academia. I think that it's important that we all try to pull together. When we talk about issues like global warming and climate science, there is so much black and white discussed today. And when I first heard Dr. Hayhoe speak, I was impressed with the fact that she was emphasizing what's going on today and what can we do right now. And what action can we take given where we're at. And I respected that. It struck a chord with me. It made me feel like I could come and contribute something. Finally, my efforts are reducing the footprint of carbon footprint of lumber. I mean, anytime I help somebody save money, there's another green thing going on as well. Because when they use fewer kilowatts, then that makes the carbon footprint smaller. One of the things that I find is very interesting to talk to about people out in public is the difference between conservation and efficiency. Conservation is simply doing without. Efficiency is finding a better way to get the same results. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we leave the room today, if we shut the lights off, that's conservation. If we change a 100-watt light bulb, an incandescent bulb, with an 8-watt LED and get the same lumens, that's efficiency. We've just cut the carbon footprint of that bulb by 90%. So I enjoy being a part of the Climate Science Center. I learn a lot. I get to share a stage with esteemed colleagues like I have today. And it's a pleasure to be part of this group. Thank you much.
Thank you, Steve. Now we'll ask for our 3 panelists to come down and have a seat here in front. We'll take questions from the audience. And I'll start it off because I want to know, Dr. Forbes, you mentioned this. I've rolled the idea around of putting solar panels at my house. You talked about that the return on investment is 3 to 5 years now. For a homeowner, what is the cost of doing that, converting to solar at home?
The upfront cost, I mean, you can look it up. They vary depending on how much you're going to put up and how you're going to use it. But it can be as low as $20,000 to $30,000 all the way up to $150,000, $200,000. This depends on what you really want to do with it. The return on investment are based on government tax breaks as well as that's from federal and state and county, although I don't think there's any in the county here, but there are at the state level and there are at the federal level. And so in terms of that net metering fee, well, that's the all important thing in terms of the ROI. If the state of Texas is based on a percentage, they've kind of met the middle ground. So what is reasonable in terms of an ROI is going to depend on the net metering fees, whether or it's a rebate or it's a cost. If it continues its cost, and that's what's causing sort of the weird push of politics, what fascinates me, is you got groups referring to themselves as the Green Tea Party, who are these conservative libertarians who are arguing we should be able to do this without the interference of big utilities or government. And then you've got themselves that are aligning with the Sierra Club and the Environmental Defense Fund. In sense, these weird bedfellows, and those are the groups that are coming together and fighting these reversals of net metering. From the environmental perspective, it's more, you're removing any type of incentive that we have to do better or more fuel efficient or energy efficiency and how we produce electricity.
Any other questions? Anybody got a question? Yes, sir.
I have sort of a two-part question. I think Steve might be the best one to address this. I moved here from Houston, and so in Houston, as in most of the rest of Texas, that's part of ERCOT, you have millions of companies to choose from. And so I didn't realize that Lubbock was not part of ERCOT.
Right.
And I was wondering why that is. There's probably some historical explanation. And then I was also wondering how many of the wind farms in the Panhandle, particularly down near Sweetwater, are actually part of our local interchange and powering Lubbock versus going to other parts of the state.
Well, that's a timely question because ERCOT, the Energy Reliability Council of Texas, is the power pool that is most of the state of Texas. The Panhandle and down to Lubbock is part of what's called the Southwest Power Pool. The Southwest Power Pool, until recently, ended south of Lubbock. It has now pushed its way north of Lubbock because there's pretty substantial wind farm being built on Flint County. We've been in the Southwest Power Pool for as long as I know, but Lubbock is in the process right now of making a move to ERCOT. In fact, by 2019, when our current contract expires with Xcel Energy, we intend to be part of the ERCOT grid. That's going on right now. Now, bear in mind that that doesn't mean that there'll be a change in providers in Lubbock, because within ERCOT, the Texas Public Power Association is the group which is all of the municipal utilities. And we're a municipally owned utility, which means that our city council and the mayor basically are the final word on rates and whatever. We have a board of directors and then a director. The competing companies in ERCOT are investor-owned utilities. They're there to make a buck for investors. Their motive is profit. Our motive is service. There are no municipal utilities in ERCOT that are currently deregulated, although Austin is going through some interesting times right now. There's a possibility that might happen. Our rates have always been really competitive, and I don't think you'll see that happen here, but we're moving in the direction of ERCOT. And to answer your question, right now, all the wind farms that you see between here and Dallas or between here and Austin are part of ERCOT, but they're something that we intend to have access to soon. I was telling Robert and some of the folks in CSC earlier, Texas is the largest wind power state in the nation. We have twice as much wind power as the next largest state, which I believe is Iowa. And if I'm not mistaken, if Texas were a country, we would be the 6th largest country in the world.
Yes, sir.
Related to that, when we switch to ERCOT, what will be the percentage of electricity in Lubbock from renewable sources as compared to now?
That is difficult to say specifically, but I would expect that number to rise substantially. There has been a point when 40% of ERCOT's power was provided by wind alone. ERCOT currently has approximately 25,000 megawatts, I think, of wind power, and solar being added to that as well. So whereas at present, I think we're maybe around 10% renewable, I would expect that to increase dramatically. because Lubbock's gonna be in a position where we can go out on the market now and buy renewables. And there have been some folks that have contacted us with some pretty attractive potential future deals that have to do with solar and wind.
Yes, sir.
I have two questions, and they might be more for Robert and Pam. The first question is, in those studies, for example, of Colorado, what kind of agriculture might they have been? And the reason I ask that is we have here on the South Plains a lot of cotton fields with the resident owner or a resident hired hand living in the midst of the cotton field where there is an active well going up and down, and they're very old wells, although we have some new wells in the last 5 years. So those pump jacks that are very, very old, I assume have more leakage than the newer ones, but I don't know if that's the case. Less leakage, maybe because, quote, they're more efficient, using less electricity or less natural gas to move the pump jack up and down. And then later, if somebody else has a question, we'll let them. And the last one would be, when the health board was testifying council to increase the distance of a well from a home, which at that time the council rejected. Did you have the data on benzene? I don't recall hearing the data about benzene at that time.
Well, let me answer your two-part questions. One is, did the Colorado studies control for old versus new wells or agriculture? I know the Colorado studies counted every well. And they would have picked up wells that were used, that were in the midst of agriculture. If they were used for oil and gas, not if they were water wells. I don't know if they control for age of wells. One of the other studies, the Casey study, actually did a very complex calculation for production, age of well, and a number of other factors. Certainly, the researchers looked for active wells versus inactive wells. What the researchers in Colorado did was they controlled for other sources of volatile organic compounds. That's why all the studies were done in rural Pennsylvania or rural Colorado, because traffic and highways are a major source of volatile organic compounds, and so that factor was attempted to be controlled for. Regarding what happened in City Council, actually we were successful in our bid to increase setbacks. The Board of Health as members of the Board of Health, I was chair of the fracking committee. That's how don't ask me how I started it, but that's how this started. I was chair of the fracking committee, and we came up with recommendations to increase setbacks to 1,500 feet. Our current setbacks are 300. Well, City Council didn't like that very much, and so they set up a oil and gas advisory committee where our voices were diluted by the voices of many stakeholders. And eventually we recommended to the oil and gas committee rejected our request even to get setbacks to 600 feet and forwarded a recommendation to City Council to stay at 300. But then after that, I and my colleague argued back to City Council based on new data, many of the things I showed you, that it really should be 600 feet. And actually that vote, we won that vote. And so City Council passed an amendment that setback should be increased from 300 to 600. Better than 300, worse than 1,500. And just a few weeks later, after that, House Bill 40 came out, essentially canceling all setbacks that had been voted for by individual cities, placing us back to the Texas standard, which is about 250 feet, more or less.
Along those lines, I mean, that's how I met Dr. Epstein when I first arrived here. Catherine got a call saying, is anybody over at Tech doing work on hydraulic fracturing? I've been doing work, that's primarily where my research was, from 2004 forward. So all the recommendations were based on mitigating to the greatest degree possible the risks that are inherent. The idea was, and I told the group, banning is a fool's errand. And HB 40 is a direct reaction to Denton's ban to vote to ban fracking. This charges right up against the state's interest, but in typical fashion, it's a bit hypocritical of them to say the best decisions are made locally because they understand the conditions, and yet, because their interests are at stake in many ways, they basically ceased the local policymaking process with regard to anything to do with hydraulic fracturing. To your question about the rural areas, there's studies out of Duke in the Bakken Shale that demonstrate that it's not just human health that's affected, but agricultural health as well, in terms of like cattle, various other livestock, animals, the ecosystem writ large, that there is an effect in similar fashion as there are to human proximity. The idea in rural, though, for the most part across the United States, the most intense development is in rural areas as opposed to more metropolitan areas, unlike them.
I think we have time for about one more question. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Have folks been able to put a dollar figure in terms of the increased medical cost or is that's the next step to go on beyond?
I would love to see that.
Yeah.
It would be very, very good point to make to
Right. So
legislators.
yeah, that would take it into the other green.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Field.
That would be a wonderful field. There was just a paper published on the cost of human illness due to air pollution, came out this week, and I would love to see a similar study. But you realize these studies just came out since 2014 was the first one. The rest of them are less than a year old now. So yeah, I would love that.
Just real briefly, it's called a closed loop system. So closed loop systems basically capture the produced water as well as the VOCs, as well as natural gas. And it was trial run here in Texas. And the energy producers are actually on board with it because they showed significant savings to their operating costs if they were to do the closed loop systems rather than the old way of doing things. So EPA now, in terms of new wells, they're required those closed loop systems, but in terms of the grandfathered wells, they're not required. So this is, Steve's right. You have to argue the other green. You can't argue the green.
So on the Oil and Gas Committee, our requests for a closed loop system were completely met with deaf ears. Whoever heard of this, why would anybody want to do it? It's too expensive.
Sir, do you have a real quick question?
Well, my question was, are there confounding factors in like where these studies were with the oil wells, such as poverty and other things that could be used as to explain?
There were attempts to control for all these factors. For example, benzene levels are very high in smokers. And birth defects are higher in low-income groups. And so there was attempts to randomize and control for all these factors. The researchers did a very good job of attempting to control for these factors. And it's not easy. But yes, there were.
So what's the rebuttal to this? It's pretty straightforward.
What, the gas wells make you sick?
Yeah.
No, gas wells make you sick.
No, but there's no, I mean, what?
No, the closer you live, the sicker you get. You mean, why was it defeated in Lubbock?
Well, landowners.
The argument,
It's the other green, I know.
right, the argument that the mayor made was that all this applies to high volume hydraulic fracturing for natural gas shale wells. And what we have is oil wells and they're low volume hydraulic fracturing, therefore it doesn't apply. That was the argument.
I believe he also said that we should not have that because this would inhibit residential development in northeast Lubbock. And so we want to have more housing out there. If we had increased setbacks, investors would not build houses in northeast Lubbock. And of course, he has some real estate out there too. So I don't know, but that is theoretically both an argument. But I don't know if anybody has done a study of proximity of new residential development in terms of people seeking zoning modifications to put in development versus those who are put further away from the development. And I guess in the case of or southwest Lubbock.
You're talking about something called reverse setbacks. A setback is something that the oil and gas driller or operator observes from existing housing. There is something else called a reverse setback where developers are forbidden to build within a certain distance from the oil and gas well. Very few communities went with reverse setback, and that fell on totally deaf ears in the oil and gas community in Lubbock. You know, it's called spoon feeding people or something. So that fell on deaf ears. There are studies showing that property values decrease for houses close to gas wells. And I think that may be politically the most expedient method to deal with this issue.
Do we have anybody here that's got one of the infrared cameras that works in the bandwidth where you can detect the VOCs?
Right now, Grant's got my camera riding around Lubbock doing studies. But yeah, we do have a camera that we can fit with the
I want to thank everybody for coming out today. We've got to let these fine experts go. Let's give them another round of applause. We'll see you next month.